So this is going to be a quick video that's going to act as a guide for each of the 4 classes in Deep Rock Galactic for ranking each of their grenades. There's been some talk recently in the Deep Rock community on the different types of grenades, and I don't want to talk about the bunker one. I'm going to talk about the grenade one. So the first thing that I want to talk about with the grenades is that each of the 4 classes is going to be using their grenades in different ways. The gunner is primarily is a damage dealing class, therefore his grenades are generally damage dealing. The scout is a mobile type, so their grenades are more predominantly centered around crowd control than actually damage. The driller's options are damage options. However, he has a much wider range of damage options. And the engineer is kind of the jack of all trades, so he has a lot of gimmicks up his sleeve. Know this going into it. Now, the driller can play, or the gunner, sorry, can play any of his 4 grenades, depending on what your loadout is going for. Looking at each of the grenades will explain from bottom to top what my grenades choices would be. At number 4 is the Tactical Lead Burster. The Tactical Lead Burster is similar to like a proximity mine, although it's activated. Essentially what happens is you throw it, after about a half a second, it fires off volleys of gunshots in a radius. The closer you are to it, the less damage it will do to compensate for the accuracy of the bullets hitting. So being further away does do more. Now this is basically a certified kill on most things on higher hazard difficulties from a friendly fire perspective. You can 2-shot most of your dwarves on higher difficulties because of the friendly fire on it. In my opinion, this is not a great option. It's fairly easy to hit in crowds, but it really only comes into play in tight corridors. In open rooms, you might be able to hit a lot of things, but you're not actually going to be doing a significant amount of damage. I'm just not particularly fond of it. Coming in at number 3 is the Incendiary Grenade. Now, the Incendiary Grenade has a niche in that it's very good for triggering gunners' various burning effects without actually having to use mods to increase fire damage. So a good example of this is if you want to run Burning Hell, Volatile Bullets Heavy Revolver, what you can do is instead of running something like Burning Hell Minigun or the Hot Bullets, to do it that way, you can instead run an Incendiary Grenade, chuck an Incendiary Grenade, and then start unloading. The downside is you are wasting your grenade slot to get that proc off. The fire damage is also relatively random in how it spreads. So it's not very easy in terms of controlled damage. It's not very easy to guarantee hits. The duration of it is pretty good, and the damage on it is pretty good, but it's also something that you can only carry 4 of, which does limit your uses to it. If you're planning on using a large amount of supply drops, this is obviously not going to be an issue, but if you're somebody like me who likes to just go in solo and kind of speed run missions, where I generally don't call more than 1 supply drop a mission, this is something I don't necessarily prefer. Now, the top 1-2 options come down to personal preference. To me, my old number 1 was the Cluster Grenade for raw damage, with the Sticky Grenade at 2 for utility. I can kind of go back and forth. Right now, the Cluster Grenade is at 2, and the main reason why I have my Cluster Grenade at 2, the raw damage on it is great. You throw the grenade, it explodes, and then the explosions explode, and they explode, so you get a decent area of effect chain explosion. This makes it good for crowds, but poor for one-on-one scenarios. The main reason why I stopped running it, though, is that you only carry 4 of them, and the economy on it's not that great. Whereas on sticky grenades, if I stick it, it does a large amount of damage, it causes a fear, and when it explodes, it's going to run it back into its friends, and it explodes. It is more reliable damage than the cluster grenade is. even though it's not as sheer impactful for area of effect. I've primarily been running this just so I have an option to go with. Either way, I don't think you go wrong on either of those two. I would just avoid the tactical lead burster, and the incendiary is kind of a niche pick. A lot of people have been saying that the scout stun sweeper is pretty bad. My list is going to be very different. So, of your 4 grenade options, you have to note that none of these are direct damage dealing grenades. The only grenade that deals any direct damage is the stun sweeper. All of these are meant to be crowd control based weapons, and the most notable reason why a lot of people prefer the cryo and the IFG is because of Bullets of Mercy on the deep core. However, I'm not a fan of Bullets of Mercy. I don't use Bullets of Mercy. I prefer the overclock firing mechanism. So because of that, my grenade list might be a little bit skewed. At the bottom of the food chain is the pheromone canister. Essentially, anything that is in this area will just attack each other. It doesn't work on aerial targets, so like, it's not going to make Mactera shoot grounded targets. It's not going to make grounded targets try and climb the walls and hit Mactera. Doesn't work like that. But it lasts for 15 seconds, and basically anything in the circle will attack one another. If there's nothing in that circle, or if the enemies aren't affected by the canister, they're still going to attack you. This is terrible, and it got made worse when you consider that the Bolt Shark has a special bolt that does the same thing. If you don't want to use either of the 2 special bolts, which I don't, you can instead run this in, so you get 9 special bolt pheromones that last 12.5 seconds, as opposed to getting 4 grenades that last for 15 seconds. So you get more than double the amount of grenade power in exchange for this. You can also shoot those rounds into a specific enemy, like a Praetorian, a Grunt Guard, Slasher, and the rest of the enemies will attack it. This lets you take out the strongest thing in the room by making it the target of all the smaller things, as opposed to having to burn a grenade slot. Now, the other 3 choices, in my opinion, are all good. For my personal preference, the IFG is at number 3. Now, similar to the incendiary grenade, the reason why I have this at 3, what it does is it reduces the movement speed of enemies that go through it. It also adds a 30% debuff, so they take 30%, they deal 30% less damage, and they take 30% more damage. It also counts as an electrical field for any electric mods. You get to carry 6 of them. It lasts a good amount of time. There's the downside to this is you need the enemies to walk through it in order to proc your effects. This is very good for anything that has electrical damage. If you're running Zukovs, if you're running Bullets of Mercy, if you're running any modifiers around electricity. The downside is it inherently doesn't do much other than it slows them, and if they take a little bit more damage, mostly from electric sources. I'm personally not a fan of it unless you're actively trying to apply debuffs. The reason is the slow on it, while good, if you use it against large crowds, you're using it for the slow rather than the bonus damage. If you use it against single targets, you're using it for the damage bonus rather than the slow. So it's kind of like there are other tools that are better. At number 2 is the cryo grenade. Now, the cryo grenade's biggest downside is the arc on it is kind of hard to hit. If you hit something in air, it will instantly freeze it and shatter, except for the Nemesis breeders because they got buffed in the last patch, so they now require 2 cryo grenades to insta freeze. It's very good for throwing into a group, freezing, and then just trying to do as much damage as possible in that short amount of time because everything takes double damage. The downside to the cryo grenade, again, is that the IFG, enables more damage than the cryo. The cryo gets the advantage because it has that insta power. It is very good against Mactera. It is very good against anything that you are trying to kill quickly, particularly if you're trying to kill something like directly in your face where you just cryo and power attack with the pickaxe. This is going to be a very quick way to clear out a crowd. But it's held back by the 4. I've started playing around with the Voltic Stun Sweeper, and I find this to be absurdly good. The way this works is it works like a boomerang. You throw it. The first enemy you hit is going to cause bounces. It can bounce up to 9 enemies at an 8.5 second stun duration. The damage doesn't matter. It does apply a minor damage over time effect, which does trigger your electric things. I personally prefer that over the slow on the IFG. It is an 8.5 second stun. It is one of the single longest stuns in the game. And for my play style on Scout, I have been preferring this because it gives me the ability to act as a get out of jail free card more than the IFG or the cryo, because I can hit multiple enemies and get out of trouble. The damage on it isn't good, but you're not running it for the damage. You're running it for the stun, and the electric damage is nice if you even are running Bullets of Mercy. Next up on the Driller. The Driller has probably the second biggest argument for grenade choice. 3 of their grenades are very good. At the bottom is the spring-loaded Ripper. This is a very difficult grenade to use. The way it works is it rolls along walls and it follows the terrain of the environment and the wall. It does a large amount of damage, but it really only works in tight tunnels, similar to the Lead Burster, where you can just roll it around in a circle. It's also a absurdly high friendly fire risk. I'm just personally not a fan of this thing because of the RNG involved, because of how the terrain, it revolves around the terrain. Then coming in at number 3 is the Neurotoxin Grenade. This is a poison over time grenade. It lasts for 7.5 seconds, and if you can set it on fire relatively easily. This means the EPC and the flamethrower are the 2 best options for this. The downside to the grenade, in my opinion, is that it is 4. You only carry 4. The poison damage on its own isn't great. It's mainly there because you can poison and then set it on fire. But the duration of the grenade is what will also burn. Meaning, you have to set it on fire right away if you want the 10 seconds of the burning cloud. This also can do a large amount of damage as well. The HE grenades are a absurdly high damage. They have a larger area of effect, a better armor break, and more damage than the sticky grenades, but they don't stick, and thus the fear on them isn't as great. These are good standard, grenades. There's nothing I can really say on it. They're very easy to use, and they're very reliable. They're also very good for armor break, which is one of the few things that Driller has, but he doesn't have great armor break, because most of his weapons kind of just ignore armor. However, nothing beats the Impact Axe. It's 160 damage, which is the highest damage, with a small 80 damage area of effect. You can carry 8 of these. They give you a long range option. They are high burst damage. If you miss, you can go and pick them back up. You can just throw these things in the ground at a supply drop and come back and pick them up later. These are by far the best grenade in the game because of its sheer utility and range. You can use it as single target, you can throw it into a crowd, and you will hit something. These are arguably the best grenade. They're one of the best grenades in the game, and it's kind of hard to choose. While the HE grenade and the Neurotoxin grenade are both good options, the Impact Axes are just so much better that it's like, yes, you're going to pick the Impact Axes, but if you weren't picking that, you'd have a hard choice between these 2 as your second. Last up on Engineer. Engineer has an interesting playstyle. He has a distraction, a damage option, a proximity option, and a defensive option. So he has a lot of options. At the bottom of the food chain for me are the proximity mines. They do a decent amount of damage, but they require an arming time, and you only get to carry 4 of them. These are great for setting up traps in certain areas, particularly if you're fighting dreadnoughts or in defend your position segments. But the fact that they have an arming time means you can't really use them freely in combat, and because of the fact that they are giant liabilities, you can accidentally detonate these with your own gunfire. This can be an advantage later on if you can place it where you think enemies are going to come from and shoot it there. But more often than not, teammates will accidentally shoot these. I think they're just a bit too cumbersome to use. Next up would be the SSG. These are interesting. So the way they work, you can only use one of these at a time. You throw it out, and it releases a small swarm of shredders that will kind of follow you and attack any nearby enemies to you or enemies in their sight. And after a certain amount of time or a certain amount of damage done, they'll expire. And they do apply a double burst of damage to the first target that they hit. These things are nice defensive options, but I find that the sentry turrets that you have are better suited for this, for how I place my sentry turrets, at least. If you only run one sentry turret, or if you are running a sentry turret build that's primarily just based around like turret whip or the arcing turrets, then these can be a very good defensive option. But again, only carrying 4 of them limits the usability that you have. At number 2 would be the lures for me. Even though these last for you only carry 4, they last for 20 seconds, and they will attract up to 10 enemies at a time. These can be very good for just throwing these into an area and to line up a group of people for whatever your secondary weapon of choice is to blow them up, whether you're using the grenade launcher, whether you're using the breach cutter, or whether you're using the shard diffractor. These are very good distraction tools. They can help get revives off. The only downside to them is that they don't do damage unless the explosion goes off at the end of the 20 seconds, and by then whatever's nearby should be dead. On higher hazard difficulties, these are incredibly useful, and they're incredibly useful for team play, but for individual one-on-one type scenarios like I tend to play, these aren't as good. My personal choice is the Plasma Burster. These are essentially just bouncing Bettys. They bounce a certain amount of times, and they deal damage in an area of effect. You get to carry 6 of these. These are my primary option. If you get good with managing the bounces, you can clear out incredible amounts of groups with them. It just gives you another wave clearing option. All in all, it really depends on your team composition if you're going for damage or if you want the defensive option on the lure. I would not recommend these 2. Anyways, that would be the quick Season 3 guide on grenades. I would like to see them buff some of the grenades up a little bit. The cluster grenade, I would like to see a little bit of a buff to the cluster. Definitely one to the lead burster. On the pheromone canister definitely needs a buff to it, although I think the rest are fine. The Rippers could use a little bit of love, as could the HE grenade, and definitely the SSG and the proximity mine could use a buff. Everything else is pretty good though.